You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another day, another week. It's been a hot minute. I apologize for that. Have had some crazy times lately. The last few weeks have been pretty busy. Last week I was out of town, and then the week before that I had a bunch of meetings and some other stuff, and a special opportunity to do something that I'll be able to talk about later that revolves around Utah. But for now, I kind of have to keep that under wraps. So that took a lot of my time. So I apologize for not being able to get to podcasts recently. Obviously, we've been doing these scheduling series, trying to look at the different opponents that Utah will be playing this year as we gear up for Big 12 Media Days. Next week is Big 12 Media Days. So we're going to try to get the last four out, in these last, the last weekish. So you're going to hear a lot from me. We'll get through a lot of these and make sure we dive into all that. So today we're going to recap some of the news over the last couple of weeks, provide an update on Utah recruiting, and then we'll continue that scheduling series that I talked about with Utah's next opponent, which will be in-state rival BYU. So looking forward to that one, being able to get into the rivalry. So here we go. So first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Feeling confident about your finances changes everything. And that's where Canyon View Credit Union comes in. They focus on helping you build something strong over time and at your pace and in a way that fits your life. With Canyon View Credit Union, it's not about one-size-fits-all solutions. It's about steady progress, real guidance, and having someone in your corner who's there for the long run. Through every step, every chapter, every goal, Canyon View Credit Union is right there with you. And honestly, that kind of support just feels different. Learn more about how Canyon View Credit Union can help you build your own momentum at canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. All right, let's jump into this. Like I said, it's been a busy couple weeks. Some of this stuff you've probably already known, but we're going to recap some of it in case you've missed it. So we're going to go quick on a lot of these things and dive right into it. So first off, last week, the NCAA approved the age-based model. And what that means essentially is that athletes now only have 5 years to compete. There's no red shirts. There's no waiting or waivers or anything like that. You get 5 years, you play 5 years. And so essentially that comes down to, once you graduate or your 19th birthday, whichever one comes first, that's when your 5-year clock starts. And this isn't retroactive in the sense that any seniors this year who have only played 4 years, they don't get an extra year. So this is only for future players or players that have had expired eligibility. Now, with that said, there's some questions about what this entails. Some of that revolves around, obviously, LDS athletes that want to serve an LDS mission. They will still have an opportunity to be able to quote unquote, redshirt those 2 years, right? It's just a religious exemption, and that's going to be allowed. So the 5 years will start. That'll still get a little messy for some of these athletes, but it's been happening across the country for years, so it's not really that much of a change. But once you basically graduate high school or your 19th birthday, whichever one comes first, that begins your 5-year clock. So players don't have to worry about sitting out for, only playing 4 games and sitting out the rest. It's not worrying about, trying to keep players and then redshirting them. How many games do you get them? It's you get 5 years to play 5 years. And the one drawback there is, yes, if you get, a bad rash of injuries and you don't get to play long, there is no medical hardships or waivers that way, but you do get 5 years to play. And you would have to assume that in 5 years, you get an opportunity to be able to at least play consistently. So, it can go both ways, but I think in a lot of ways, this provides a lot of consistency for the NCAA. It provides a structure that was always kind of up and down. There's several times where, for example, Utah would try to petition and get a player eligible, and it wouldn't go their way. Meanwhile, other schools were able to get that, and there was just no rhyme or reason in a lot of respects, and it depends on how much you fought for that player. I'm not saying that Utah didn't fight for some of these players, but it was just kind of chaos, and there was no rhyme or reason to a lot of it. So 5 years to play 5 years. That'll essentially be it. As part of this, there is questions about who will be eligible, and I know the Utah football coaches will be, reviewing the rosters and then trying to see what's happening. This will impact, recruiting in terms of, the players that they can keep, because you still have to have that cap of your roster. And so if Utah is, recruiting the standard 20 to 25 players every single year, this first year is going to, you're going to run up to it. So that means either you're going to have to let some of these players go, or try to figure out, how you manage that. Obviously, some of these players will enter the transfer portal. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. But this first year, especially, there's going to be a lot of challenges with that, especially if some of these players that have, 4 years, have already played 4 years, want their fifth year, there's still that opportunity. And one of those players is Devin Dampier. Devin Dampier has the opportunity to be able to play a fifth year if he wants to. So obviously, Devin wants to be able to have a successful season and go to the NFL this year. But if for whatever reason Utah or Devin can't get to that and this becomes his best option, that may be a scenario where Utah looks to keep Devin Dampier. Obviously, everybody that knows this, but Bird Ficklin is the future of this team. But, Utah's got to do things to be able to win now. And so if it is Devin Dampier and that's where they need to go and they need to take him for another season, maybe that's the direction that they go. Bird Ficklin also has to take the next steps to be able to progress, and there's no guarantee there. So there's a lot of give and take here. There's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be had, this year and in the off season about what's going to happen, and how players move. The ideal situation here for Utah fans is, a player like Devin Dampier balls out this year. He does well enough to be able to get an NFL invite and he moves on. Obviously, if he's, marginally there, you still want him here, right? He's been a solid quarterback for Utah, but I think that makes it easier for Utah if Bird Ficklin takes those next steps. So we'll see. There's going to be a lot of questions as it relates to this, but I think this as a whole is a good standard for the NCAA to be able to make things better. A little side note, not a side note, but a smaller thing that took place was also the NCAA will now allow FCS teams to participate in, quote, joint practices with FBS teams in spring. What this does is it essentially opens up the doors for FBS teams a la Utah to be able to compete with a team like Weber State in a joint practice, meaning you could have a spring game against an FCS opponent. This has always been something that I think is the best option for the FCS games, right? We've seen these schedules, especially as conferences are trying to push more of these games out. A lot of these FCS teams are being left in the dust, right? These are games that are buy games for a lot of these programs. There's a lot of money that comes to these programs for playing in FBS school, excuse me. And so the potential to lose that changes how that metric works. So in theory, the Big 12 has talked about maybe potentially scheduling 10 conference games, which means you have 2 other non-conference games. Most likely, you're not going to get an FCS opponent there. It's going to be maybe an A team or a B team that comes in there, to try to schedule something competitive. But FCS teams are most likely going to go by the wayside. So this gives you an opportunity to still say, hey, come participate in spring. This gives some meaning to the spring games. You can still play your 2s and 3s because at the end of the day, if you lose, it doesn't really matter. And I know, that's going to drive people crazy if they do lose to an FCS team, but it's spring, right? If anything, it just means you have something more to prove. Now, I can't wait for this to happen and then suddenly an FCS team wins in spring and that completely tanks their AP top 25 ratings or whatever have you coming into the preseason. There's going to be some kerfuffles, so to speak, of teams wanting to do that. So really fascinated to see what happens, but I think this would be a great opportunity to have a true spring game, right? You obviously want to preserve guys and not get guys hurt, but you could have some certain limits on there where you say, look, we're not going to go crazy. We're not going to go fully hard, but at least you get more of a simulated game than, red versus white or whatever have you, and you're holding guys out. So really fascinated to see what happens there, but still too early for that, but at least there is that opportunity for that joint venture, joint practice to be able to happen. Lastly, of the new news, we've got Utah signed with Adidas last week. So this was obviously the apparel outfitter that was talked about a ton. I mentioned it on our podcast as well about how Adidas was the leading candidate for Utah. Under Armour did not want to lose this contract, but obviously Under Armour hasn't been able to do well at keeping a lot of these contracts. And at the end of the day, Utah decided to move on to Adidas. Now, this deal is a 7-year deal. Uh, we don't have full numbers yet, but my understanding is that these numbers are essentially the same per year. But there's an added bonus for the athletes where they get to sign essentially NIL deals with Adidas where they can kind of create their own brand ambassadors type, situation. So they can go out there, they can put their stuff on Instagram or TikTok or wherever have you, and then get their own deals through this apparel partnership, which they did not have with Under Armour. So the money itself may be the same, or at least close the ballpark, but now you're giving your athletes another opportunity to be able to make money. And for a high profile athlete, let's say like Devin Dampier, there's a lot of potential there to now become an Adidas athlete, right? To be able to go in there and rock some of those shoes, to be able to have a lot of NIL opportunities where Adidas is helping. So there's, excuse me, had to catch my breath there. Adidas gives them a lot of opportunity. And in football, there's not a ton of what am I trying to say? There was a lot of negative recruiting against Under Armour, especially in football and in basketball. Simply because, there was a lot of people that didn't love the Under Armour cleats. The injury documentation was well recorded, even though there's not necessarily anything more to that. But a lot of people said that they did not like wearing those cleats. And so this gives Utah an opportunity now to have an Adidas cleat, which Adidas has been in the shoe business for, decades. They understand how to make these shoes. They understand what to do. And, these Adidas cleats are far superior to that. On the basketball side, you also have a much better opportunity with shoes, people that, give you a little bit more of a leg up. Obviously, everybody wants Jordan or Nike, whatever, but Adidas is still an up and coming, not up. They kind of dipped, right? So I'm saying they're up and coming in the new wave. There's a lot of NBA athletes that have Adidas shoes. This is a good opportunity for Utah to stay in that recruiting pitch instead of having that negative, conversation about, oh, you have to wear Under Armour shoes. So there's a lot to take here. Adidas, was going to give Utah, like I said, the money that they were getting from Under Armour. Plus, you get those NIL deals. This is a good opportunity for Utah. We'll see how it pans out at the end of the day, but I still think this is a better opportunity for Utah as a wholesale change, right? Whether it be the recruiting side of it, whether it be the actual product, we'll see what the jerseys look like and if those are going to be okay. But at the end of the day, this still feels like it's going to be a much more profitable and advantageous partnership for Utah. So we'll see. It's an apparel outfitter. For the most part, that doesn't impact most fans. Obviously, it does with the apparel that you can purchase. But I think at the end of the day, you can kind of find Utah stuff on most outfitters. So that's out there. I mean, Adidas quality is still good out there. It's definitely much more of, let's say, a soccer brand worldwide. But in the United States, it's growing more and more where Adidas is becoming a much bigger product. The NFL had Adidas for years. I've heard from several NFL athletes that said that they loved their Adidas apparel. So we'll see. There's probably somebody out there that doesn't like it, somebody that does. It doesn't really matter personally. I think this is just a good opportunity for Utah. All right, let's transition here to recruiting. The last 2 weeks have been very busy for Utah. They wrapped up their official visits, and you've started to see a lot of commitments. So the last time that we talked, I think Utah had 8 commitments at that point. They've now since signed 12 more players, or at least not signed, but they've gotten commitments from 12 more players. And if you're looking on YouTube, you can see this list right here already of the players that have committed. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see this right here. My colleague Steve Bartle is writing articles on every single one of these, so you can get more information on that at KSL Sports. But at the same time, this is a big class right now, 20 total commits. But the thing that I want to point you to is that Utah is going very heavily into the in-state recruiting. Um, right now, of the 20 players, 8 are committed from Utah. And over the last few years, that wasn't always the case. That's not to say that Kyle Whittingham wasn't committed to in-state players. He was. But there's a much bigger shift from Morgan Scalley, and the conversations that have been had with him essentially have pointed to he really wants to hone in on Utah recruiting. He sees that there's programs from all across the country that come in here and try to take kids from Utah. Why shouldn't Utah be trying to take a lot of these kids? They have a lot of talent. It may not be as rich as, let's say, a Texas or a Florida or a California, but that's not to say that Utah doesn't have a lot of talent here in this state. Now, as part of that, yes, Utah has missed on some of the top recruits, but so has BYU in this state because Oklahoma has made a massive push recently to be able to come in here and get a lot of these players. A Crew Jones, Bodie Sparrow, those two guys alone have, at the top of the board. There are some of the players that are at the top of the board that have decided to go elsewhere. You're never going to get every player from your state. But at the same time, Morgan Scalley is doing his best to be able to make the recruiting pitch revolve around staying in Utah, trying to say this is the place where you can succeed. They've got, a whole bunch of stuff with their general manager that is going to kind of paint the picture of why staying in Utah is the best opportunity. You've got Morgan Scalley putting a ton of emphasis into it and trying to be able to say, hey, this is where you can play. Now you've got your home fans, you've got your family, you've got all the connections that you need to, the same resources that you can get at most of these other programs in the country here in Utah. And so as much as this isn't a massive shift from Kyle Whittingham, there's subtle differences along the way, especially in the recruiting side of this, where you're starting to see the differences with Morgan, where he is emphasizing a lot of the Utah athletes and trying to make sure that he brings them in. Part of that is you do get a huge buy-in, right? It's easier to build a culture if you do have people that have been around the program for a long time. Maybe they've been fans of the school for years and understand what it is. It's so much easier to get buy-in that way. This doesn't mean that Utah, a la Morgan Scalley, is going to just absolutely go Utah and no other state. That would be crazy. But this is an opportunity for him to be able to really cement and kind of put a barrier around the state of Utah to try to say, hey, these are the players that we need. Maybe the Bodie Sparrow, who grew up as a Utah fan, he can say, look, this is where we're going to be. I can stay here and get the same resources that I need. Obviously, parts of that too comes with NIL. You do need higher NIL for some of these players. And quite honestly, some of these players are asking way too much as a freshman, right? And so you're going to see Utah heavily invested in a lot of these players. But if the dollar figures don't match what they think they are going to get, that may be a reason why you're passing on a local kid or any other kid in the country, right? Utah isn't going to necessarily overspend for a player as a freshman. There's just too many variables there to make it difficult. You can at least go into you can go into the transfer portal. I lost my thought there for a second. You can go into the transfer portal and you can pull players with at least understanding of how they've played, what kind of work ethic they have at the Division 1 level, that kind of stuff. Some of these players that you get from the high school ranks, you're doing a lot of research on them and you're watching them at the high school level and you're doing all these different things to be able to project them, but there's no guarantee that when they come to college that they're going to be able to produce at that same level. So you're going to see a balancing act there where, Morgan Scalley is going to invest heavily in Utah players, but at the same time, it has to be for the right price. And so you're going to see a lot of the changes there. I think you're going to see a lot of emphasis on trying to go heavy on a lot of these players. Next year's recruiting class, meaning 2027 kids, that's a very heavy, good, solid recruiting class for the state of Utah. There's going to be a heavy emphasis from Morgan Scalley and his recruiting staff to be able to commit a lot of these players from the state, beef up the trenches. You're going to try to get the skills players. You're trying to do a lot of those things. This is where Morgan Scalley and his recruiting staff is going to spend a bulk of their time. Like I said, they're not going to ignore Texas. They're not going to ignore Florida, California, all the hotbeds that they've had for so long. But at the same time, there's going to be subtle shifts there that we're going to see, and you're already starting to see that. So that's kind of that I think it's a good opportunity for Utah. Kyle Whittingham kind of went up and down with that, but you can see when you start losing in-state kids how much of a challenge that can be. For example, years ago, BYU kind of got out of the in-state recruiting for a bit. It didn't help that Utah was beating Utah, or Utah was beating BYU, 9 straight times, and so it was tougher to be able to convince players that BYU was the school. Now you're seeing the alternate where BYU is on a 3-game winning streak. They've invested heavily in NIL. They've also heavily invested into in-state recruiting. There's a lot of advantages to being able to have that. And so I think this is where you're starting to see that shift again with Morgan, and what they're trying to do. So be paying attention to that, because there's going to be a lot of changes with recruiting. And I understand, some of this stuff is tough for anybody to pay attention to, until they get on the too deep or anything. It's tough to be able to fully commit to a lot of these players. But just looking at kind of the trajectory and the pipeline for what Utah's trying to do, that's kind of what I'm trying to give you. That's why I'm not necessarily focusing on individual names here. But I think there is an advantage here to being able to go local. So we'll end with that part. Excuse me. We'll move on from that. So next week we have Big 12 Media Days, and joining us in Texas will be 4 players from Utah, 2 from the offensive side of the ball, 2 from the defensive side of the ball. Once again, if you're on YouTube, you can see who I've got up here. But the 2 players on the offensive side of the ball really comes as no surprise. It should be your 2 stars of the offensive side of the ball, and that's one, Devin Dampier, and then Wayshawn Parker. 2 guys that have seemingly taken the right steps to be able to progress and move forward. Devin Dampier has a big chip on his shoulder. He wants to be able to prove that he is the best quarterback in the league, if not one of the best quarterbacks in the country, right? He truly believes that he has the potential. Maybe I'm not, look, I don't know what his ideals are if he wants to be a Heisman winner. I think every player wants to be that. But I think those types of belief systems are there, right? He believes that he can be a better passer. He believes that he's a great runner. You combine a lot of those things in a potent offense, especially with players around you, and there's real potential there for Devin Dampier to have a solid season. We'll see, right? We want to be able to see what's happening, and I think, the messaging that he's going to give here at Big 12 Media Days will kind of be the foundation for what we're seeing from him this year going into the 2026 season. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on, just being better and being kind of the player that he needs to be to develop. In spring, we learned that he was trying to get better with his progressions, trying to be able to stay in the pocket in a way that gives him an opportunity to see the field better instead of just immediately escaping. And he wasn't fully that way where he didn't completely escape quickly, but it's maximizing his ability to read the fields as well as then getting out on the run, which, as one of his greatest suits, is being able to pass on the run. He's incredible at that. You don't want to take that away. And so it's trying to find that balance there. Really curious to hear his conversations and what he did in the offseason. Obviously went down to Arizona, brought a ton of the wide receivers down with him, and has been working hard to be able to make sure that he can have that connection and they can hit the ground running. You obviously need an offensive line that's going to gel, that's going to be effective. We'll see. That's going to still be one of the biggest questions. And, he's not going to necessarily know until the game starts. But I think if that offensive line can give him some time, Devin Dampier has real potential there. Then there's Wayshawn Parker, who is completely bought into Utah right now and taking it more serious. Not that he wasn't serious last year, but I think it's just that maturation process of a player as he's coming into his junior season now, where he now understands what it takes to be a Division I athlete, a Division I running back. And you started to see a lot of that develop at the latter part of the season, where he was starting to be a lot more effective. He was being utilized a lot more, where it wasn't, a 1A, 1B situation with Nakari Rogers. It was an opportunity where he got to cement himself as the guy. And he is very prideful in himself of wanting to get what he needs to. He's not a prideful guy, but he very much so wants to be able to have all of those accolades that he's shooting for, right? At minimum, 1,000-yard rushing season. He almost got that last year. He really wants to get to that 1,500 yards. If he's around there, there's potential, he can break those rushing records at Utah. I don't know. We'll see. At the same time, he's also going to be heavily utilized in the passing game as well. So Really curious to see his development and growth, but I think Wayshawn is a great advocate for this program, a great advocate for what Morgan Scalley wants for the program and what they're trying to do. So, two very solid players on the offensive side of the ball that are going to give you a lot of insight into what Utah is focusing on for the 2026 season. On the defensive side of the ball, you have two veteran players who I think could have really standout seasons. The first being Lance Holtzclaw, defensive end. Lance Holtzclaw, if you may remember, was one of the student athletes that got to go testify at a Senate hearing for the Senate bill that is going on right now. He was one of the players in the country that was able to represent all these player athletes, these student athletes. This was an opportunity for him to kind of showcase his leadership and ability. We've heard through spring, and I've seen it firsthand, his leadership on the field in spring. Now you're seeing him take it to the next level where he's trying to advocate for all these student athletes. All of those things are great for him to be able to move forward and progress as a player, right? You're clearly seeing him as this leader out there. Now the next step is taking it on the field. And if spring is any indication of what Lance Holtzclaw can be, this is going to be a special season for him. I think he's really unlocked a different level where he feels confident, he's being effective, and he's being a leader to be able to help lift other guys. This becomes a great opportunity for Utah. Really fascinated to hear what he has to say. He's a very smart, intellectual guy who just he breathes the culture of Utah. He's done it forever with Morgan Scalley on the defensive side of the ball. Now he gets to kind of take that to the rest of the team and be an advocate for the team there. So really solid player there. And then you get Jonathan Hall, who has been with Utah for a long time, veteran player, really solid athlete who, is going to be a focal point in that linebacker room where he gets to be kind of the central figure of what they're trying to do and being able to help that defense. I think he's going to have a special season as well. I think if Utah can fix its defensive line where they had some troubles with the run, Jonathan Hall is going to be able to do his job better. Last year there was times where he was out of place simply because he was not able to it wasn't that he was out of place. It was because the defensive tackles, for example, were out of place, and that forced him to be able to be in a situation that he, you know, wasn't supposed to be. And then it looks like he's missing tackles. There's things that he did that he made mistakes, obviously. He wasn't perfect, but I think you're going to see his level of progression grow if that defensive tackle room has improved. And I think they have. We'll see. But I think Jonathan Hall is going to be a big figure for Utah on that defensive side of the ball, where he's able to kind of be the communicator and help everything go. So this is a great group of players that are going to be able to give Utah's message, shoot it straight with you. They do a good job of being able to explain certain things. They're very candid. They're approachable in what they do, and I think you're going to have a good representation here at Big 12 Media Days for Utah. So that'll take place next week. So Tuesday and Wednesday, Utah isn't scheduled to speak formally until Wednesday. So there's going to be a bit there. The first 8 teams of the conference are going to be going on Tuesday, and the last part of that will be Utah. So we'll see how this goes. I think it'll be interesting. Big 12 Media Day essentially is the unofficial start of the football season. It's still a little bit about a month away from actually reporting to camp, but at the same time, it kind of gets the juices flowing. Guys get ready. They're still going to go back to their off-season workouts and not fully be involved with Utah, but at the same time, it becomes kind of the unofficial start to the season and seeing how these guys are going to approach it. So really fascinated to see what happens there. That's it with all that stuff. We've gone 30 minutes. I apologize. I understand that's a lot of information, but I appreciate you for sticking through. We're now going to go preview BYU as the next team on the schedule. And, we'll do this the same way as every other team that we've done. So looking at this, we're going to transition to the Big 12 odds. These odds out there are from Bovada. BYU and Utah are tied at 8.5. According to them, with the number of wins. Texas Tech is still at number 1 with Brennan Sorsby even out. So, we'll see. I think that one's going to be a really fascinating storyline going forward. But either way, you've got BYU and Utah that are essentially, from an odds maker's perspective, looked as equals right now. And as we've seen the last few years, despite one team being better than the other, these games have been very close. These games, the last 2 years, have come down to 3 points last year and 1 point the year before that. So they've been very close, as the rivalry always is. There's very few times where this is a blowout on one side or the other. These are always really close games. So, depending on how you look at this season, if Utah's doing what they need to and, they're winning the games that they need to, this game very well could determine the Big 12 title game, right? One of these teams will likely go. Maybe both could get there. I don't know, but this game very well could determine that, similar to kind of how it did last year, right? BYU got the upper hand and made it to the Big 12 title game. Had Utah won that, there's a very good likely possibility. There's a lot of qualifiers right there. A very high probability. There we go. That Utah would have been in the Big 12 title game against Texas Tech. So, this game will have a lot of implications. Both teams have questions, and it's not a guarantee on either side. But at the same time, this is two quality teams that are going to be going after it again, this time on November 7th. Now, I do love that it's actually November now. We're getting closer to the end of the season where it should be. I still think it should be on rivalry weekend. You're never going to be able to compete with a lot of the other programs out there. There's always going to be games there. And for example, the week that BYU and Utah play, Oklahoma is at Florida. Not a huge game necessarily, unless Florida has a big turnaround, but Oklahoma still should be a pretty solid team. But some of the other big games that are going to be there that week, Alabama at LSU. You can't tell me that one's not going to get a ton of coverage. Oregon at Ohio State, another one that's going to get a ton of coverage. And then Miami at Notre Dame is going to get a ton of coverage. That's at 5:30 on NBC. That game's already slated. Other games that are out there, you've got Georgia at Ole Miss, Michigan State at Michigan. Those are a lot of big games for that week. Utah and BYU will be factored into that. I'm going to guess it's probably going to be that late spot. You're probably going to get another 8:30 time. So on that side of things, it works. But once again, you're competing with a lot of big programs. So if that's the point, why not just do it on rivalry weekend? That's my little standpoint. It is what it is. Either way, this is what it is. We've got the BYU game. Oh, forgot to put that graphic up there. This game will be played, like I said, on November 7th. BYU comes into this game, so they're coming into Rice-Eccles Stadium after a home game against Arizona State. Could be a challenging game. We don't really know what Arizona State's going to provide this year. Still should be a tougher game as part of their schedule, but based on how the chips are supposed to fall, Arizona State probably more of a middling team in the conference this year. Maybe upper part of that middling side. We'll see. We'll see what Kenny Dillingham has up his sleeve this year. And then Utah comes back home after a road game against Cincinnati. And if you don't know anything about the Cincinnati team, go back and listen to my last episode that talked all about Cincinnati. Cincinnati's going to be through a big rebuild this year. So, it's going to be a tough situation because Utah's going to be on the road. But assuming that, what we know now in the preseason is the same, Utah should have the better team and have a higher likelihood of winning. But it's a road game. We don't know what's going to happen before that. Utah could be limping into this game. Utah could be, undefeated. They could have two losses. One, we don't really know. I think there's a lot of questions here, and it's unknown what's happening. So you'll remember BYU last year finished 12-2, 8-2 in the Big 12. Their only losses were to Texas Tech, once in the regular season and then once in the Big 12 championship game. Losing to Texas Tech twice essentially knocked them out of the playoffs, and so they did not get that opportunity. And so both Utah and BYU are looking for their first opportunity at the playoffs. Could it be this year? We'll find out. As the playoffs expand, obviously that's going to get easier. But I think, there's true potential where both of these programs are going to continue to lead at the top of the Big 12 if everything continues. There's still questions, like I said, but we'll see. You'll remember, and I know I hate to bring this up for Utah fans, the last meeting that these two teams had was last year at October 19th on the road. BYU won 24-21. Another close game. Kyle Whittingham kind of botched a call, quite honestly, and it didn't go Utah's way, and BYU comes away with the win. There was a lot of poor tackling. I'm not going to name names on that one, but we all know what play I'm talking about. And Bear Bachmeyer literally ran wild into the end zone. So, this is going to be another fascinating game. BYU is now on a 3-game winning streak, and it's now or never for Utah, quite honestly. And I think if Utah loses again, this becomes a big challenge for Morgan Scalley to be able to kind of right the ship. You've got to be able to get this. If not, you're spiraling, right? If not now, win. And I don't think it's quite that dire, but I think the way that recruiting has been going, especially in the advantage of BYU, with the nature of the constant shifting plates of conference realignment and kind of trying to position, you've got to beat your rival. You've got to show that upper hand, or else it becomes a challenge. So this game at home is going to be a very pivotal game. I think I'm really curious to see how Morgan Scalley approaches this game. He obviously has a love for Kalani Sitake. They're great friends. If you're driving on I-15, the kidney for cars board now has Kalani Sitake and Morgan Scalley up there. For a while, it was Bronco Mendenhall and Kyle Whittingham before Bronco decided not to be on it anymore. After that relationship soured and it just became Kyle. These two are back on that billboard. Maybe that's a sign of itself of what's going on. But there is a lot of love between them. But at the same time, Morgan Scalley is a Utah man through and through, and he wants to beat BYU like any other team, if not more. So I'm curious to hear his conversation or his comments leading up to that game and kind of what happens. Obviously, Kyle had ways to kind of just dig in the side of BYU fans that made it a challenge. But we'll see. It was two different approaches that I think are going to happen. But at the same time, this will always be an important game. You now have players on Utah's roster that have been through this game now that weren't in there last year. They've got a little bit more buy-in. There's going to be a lot of belief. The quote unquote indoctrination. We'll see. We'll see how Morgan Scalley approaches this and kind of what happens there. For BYU, jumping into this, the biggest change, obviously, Kalani Sitake was looking for another job last year. I don't know that he was looking, but it came for him with Penn State, and he was on the doorstep, essentially. He had what is understood as a handshake deal with Penn State to become their next head coach, and everything was kind of spiraling for BYU in that regard. And then suddenly, last second, BYU donors, the administration, all the people involved with that were able to pull him back and keep him at BYU. He obviously gets a big pay raise. And this is now an opportunity for him to be able to say, hey, I was worth it, right? As part of that, though, because Kyle Whittingham took the Michigan job, you had Jay Hill decide to leave to go follow him at Michigan. And so you are losing a central figure of that coaching staff, many credited Jay Hill with turning around a lot of what BYU was able to do. That's not to take away from Kalani, but I think Jay Hill provided a lot of veteran leadership and experience that gave Kalani the opportunities that he had the last couple of years, right? So this is going to be the real question of what does this BYU team look like without Jay Hill? Obviously, he's not able to coach the offensive side of the ball. He was just the defense, but maybe there was more structure there with him. I don't know. We're going to find out. In his replacement, you have Kelly Papinga, who was promoted to defensive coordinator. He'll also stay with the linebackers. He comes in and he has served in the past as a co-defensive coordinator, but he's never been a sole defensive coordinator. This will be his first opportunity to kind of take the reins and be the guy. This, to me, is one of the biggest questions there for this team is what is he able to do? What is Kelly Papinga able to do as a defensive coordinator? How different will it be than Jay Hill? And I don't want to say that there's not going to be a drop-off. I think there will be because Jay Hill is just that good of a defensive coordinator. Obviously, he's been well-respected wherever he goes, whether it was at Utah, whether he went to Weber State, then obviously to BYU, and now to Michigan. He's a very well-respected coach that deserves a lot of credit, and he's going to have a head coaching opportunity someday. Honestly, if Kyle decides to retire soon, which we never know when that's going to happen, honestly, Jay Hill would be a great fit, assuming that things go well at Michigan and that, doesn't sour. He would be a great fit. And I think you'll see a very solid head coach in the future. So That is me more just saying how big of a loss that is for BYU. I don't know anything about Kelly Poppinga in the sense of what he's able to do as a defensive coordinator. Until he's out there, we don't know. It's going to be the same thing with Colton Swan as a defensive coordinator for Utah. Obviously, I'm around Colton Swan a lot more, and so I understand kind of how he works and what his mentality is going to be. But even then, it's you've got to show up on the field, right? You've got to be able to put up or shut up type situation. So with Jay Hill, BYU had their two best defensive years in his last 2 years. He was building into that first year. Before that, honestly, one of the worst teams in the country defensively. Their statistics wise were just not great. They were kind of a mess. They had a lot of problems, and Jay Hill came in and completely changed a lot of that. And you also saw a major rise with Jay Hill. I'm not saying all of that rise was because of Jay Hill, but I think BYU always had at least a good offense. Now they have a good to great offense, and then they paired that with a great defense. And so it was much easier to be able to have that kind of stuff. So with Papinga, like I said, he was a co-defensive coordinator in Virginia with Bronco Mendenhall. His co-defensive coordinator was Nick Howell, who is a respected defensive coordinator out there. People love him. Their last season, they ranked 96th in total defense. So, tough year for Virginia, but it's hard to see completely what, Papinga is going to bring. What he has said is he wants to stick to a lot of what Jay Hill did. There's going to be a lot of trying to keep the same thing, and for good reason, right? What Jay had was really effective, and so why try to break that up and just create your own system that could mess it up, right? He does want to have a little bit of different wrinkles. He wants to have exotic disguises, simulated blitz pressures, that kind of stuff. How those will differ, we'll see. Jay Hill was really good at that as well. So I'm curious to see kind of what wrinkles, so to speak, are going to be there. But it's going to be very similar to what Jay Hill ran last year, assuming that Papinga is able to run that same defense and it is able to work. As part of this, he's talked about wanting to have, or he's said that more structured play calling matters less than raw physicality in the execution. So he wants guys that are going to fly around. He wants guys to be able to hit their assignments. He wants to be able to be technically sound, and the play calling isn't going to matter as much. Now, I think he's right in some respects, right? I think there's you obviously have to be fundamentally sound and you have to be great. But if things start to break down, the play calling that does matter. So we'll see. I'm curious to see his balance of that and what he wants to do. He's going to focus heavily on hybrid players, meaning guys that, for example, can play linebacker or then mix it up as a D end or, a safety that can drop in as a linebacker, whatever have you. He wants a lot of these hybrid players that can be effective wherever they are on the field. So we'll see how it works. I'm really fascinated to see kind of the dynamic for Kelly Papinga and what he's able to do. If they're able to maintain a lot of what Jay Hill did last year, I think this could be a really solid defense again. This is a team on both sides of the balls that didn't lose a lot. They let's see, they had 13 players enter the transfer portal and had 9 come in. This was one of the smallest classes for the transfer portals in the Big 12 and even in the nation. They had a lot of consistency. And so that speaks well to what BYU was able to do in being able to keep guys bought in, keep guys there. And if they're able to continue to build off of that, this becomes a really potent, dangerous team because BYU has a lot of the same players that already saw success last year. They obviously have seen, good and bad times, but now you've got another year where you can do that. The fear there, and I don't know that this is really a fear, is that you get complacent. I don't think this team is going to be complacent by any means, but I think now that BYU has been near the top of the Big 12 for the last couple years, it's tougher to stay there, right? Utah understands that. It's tougher to stay there because everybody's coming after you. This year, you're going to have players like Bear Bachmeier who have to take a next step because there's going to be more tape on him, and there's going to be player or coaches that can scheme against him better. Those types of things, this is how BYU has to grow. But I think with their veteran leadership, their ability to kind of stay connected and cohesive, that gives them a huge leg up moving into this season. Like I said, there's still the questions of Kelly Papinga and what that defense will look like and how they're able to maximize that and how does the structure all look. But I think at the end of the day, this is a really solid team that has done really well. And the recruits that they have brought in have been pretty solid. I mean, the guys that you lose, the two top names that you probably lose, Max Alford, linebacker who went to Michigan, and then McKay Hillstead, a quarterback who went back to Utah State. Guys that contributed, but they weren't like central figures for this team. So you're still keeping a lot of that core together while still bringing in a lot of players that are going to have an impact. So with that, let's jump into that with the roster pieces. We'll go through the offense, we'll go into the defense, and get a lot of these different things. Bear Bachmeier is your guy, right? He is the guy that is going to lead this team. Comes in as a sophomore year, and he's going to be able to be the focal point of what this team is able to do. Obviously had a tremendous amount of success last year, throwing for 300 3,000 yards, 15 touchdowns and 7 interceptions, rushed for 527 yards and 11 touchdowns. A really solid player. And I'm really fascinated to see how he takes that next step. Does he take that next step, or do we see a regression? I have to believe that he takes the next step and he moves forward and becomes another key quarterback in this conference. It's going to make it a challenge. So, assuming that he stays healthy, BYU should be fine. Behind him, they've got Trayson Burkett. We'll see what happens there. You hope that you don't have to see your backup quarterback, but Bear is the guy. He's a load to handle. He's a linebacker essentially back there. And, it's a challenge to be able to bring him down. So really fascinated to see his development and progression there and what he's able to do. I think he's going to be another solid player. And if he can continue to take those strides and move forward in Aaron Roderick's offense, there's real potential there for BYU. Now at running back, you once again return LJ Martin, who I think is probably going to be tabbed as the top running back in the conference, if not one or two. I have to fill out my all Big 12 ballot today, and I've got him at least in the top 2 of the running backs. He's just a solid guy who's produced at a high level, rushed for 1,300 yards last year, 12 touchdowns, can catch passes really well, a really solid running back that does well for BYU. The issue for BYU is if he gets hurt, they suddenly don't have as much experience. You've got Sione Moa, who's a really solid player that has shown glimpses of being able to be effective. Unfortunately for him, last year he had a life-threatening injury in September. He got hit in the thigh. He basically shut down his blood supply in his leg and really just kind of ended it. Well, it ended his season. He's the backup, right? And he's healed. He's better. Everything's fine with him. But you need a guy that can produce there. And I think they're going to be good between LJ Martin and Sione Moa. I think the two of them have a great ability to be able to be effective for BYU. That offense is going to be the same as last year. Nothing changes there. That's going to continue. And you've got the combination of LJ and you've got the combination of Bear. So it's going to be a tough challenge for anybody to be able to compete with that. From the receivers, this is the biggest question on the entirety of the team. Receivers is going to be a tall task. You don't have any receivers returning with a touchdown from last year. So literally anybody that scored a touchdown as a receiver last year is gone. Now there's one little subtle, maybe awkward side of this with Parker Kingston. Parker Kingston was kicked out of school for his legal troubles. That case was just basically thrown out recently. The prosecutors are deciding if they want to refile and be able to get into that. But at the same time, he's been practicing in the facilities, not with the team per se. I don't know. I'm not there to understand it. But, there is potential. I would hope not, but there's potential that Parker Kingston does suit up for BYU again. I would assume that he has to have a clearing from a legal situation before anything happens there. We'll see. But even then, is there going to be honor code violations that preclude him from being able to play? I don't know. We obviously saw with Jake Retzloff, he was expected to get a 7-game suspension. What would Parker Kingston get? Is it going to be, what's it going to be? I think this becomes a real challenge there. If Parker Kingston comes back, they do return their leading receiver. So there is a lot of interest from BYU fans to be able to have Parker Kingston there. But there's a lot of the legal side of issues that make this very challenging. I'm not going to weigh in on that. That's not my place. I'm not going to do that. But, there's a lot of controversy surrounding Parker Kingston and whether he should be able to play or not. If he does, obviously BYU has a proven receiver that they can go to, but at the same time, it's far from a guarantee. So I'm just going to drop that one. Don't be surprised though if there is potential that he plays. It is what it is. I don't make these rules. So there's that. So beyond that, your leading receivers are likely to be JoJo Phillips, Cody Hagan, and Kyler Jasper. He's a transfer from Oregon. These three are probably your leading receivers. None of them are over 200 receiving yards last year. So JoJo Phillips had 161 receiving yards last year. Cody Hagan, 97, Kyler Jasper, 51 yards. So not a lot of experience. I don't want to say a lot of experience, not a lot of production from these players yet. But that's not to say that they can't be effective. JoJo Phillips has always toyed with being kind of near the top of that. So really curious to see, what his ability can be as kind of the central focus of that team. Cody Hagan has been pretty solid, just hasn't been able to take that next step yet. But now that he becomes probably thrust into the starting role, what does he do? Kyler Jasper, was behind a lot of good talent at Oregon. Can he unleash that here at BYU? We'll see. But those are going to be, your top receivers. There's a lot of questions revolving around that because you don't really know. You do get two tight ends that have had a lot of production and have been effective in what they do. And Walker Lyons coming in from USC. Obviously, his younger brother is on a mission and is their future quarterback. He comes in and had 223 yards last year and 2 touchdowns. Veteran player who understands how it works. Should be a really solid asset on the line as well as a pass catcher. And then Roger Salepaga, the second, he comes in from Oregon, also, as a solid player that should be effective for BYU. So if there is any issues on the offensive side of the ball, this is where I'm going to say they're probably going to be. I have to imagine that LJ Martin, Sione Moa are going to be solid. Bear Bachmeier is going to be solid. The real question is really just going to come down to these receivers and can they be effective that way? Or are you putting more on Bear's plate to try to kind of run the offense without effective wide receivers? We saw last year, especially early on for Utah, how challenging that can be if you don't have receivers that can separate or get the progress or what am I trying to say? If they can't get the ball, we're just going to go with that. I can't think of what I was trying to say, but this is going to be their biggest situation here. Offensive line, pretty veteran line there, especially on the right-hand side of the line. It's cemented by center Bruce Mitchell, probably an all Big 12 type player, really solid player who has been really effective for BYU, grades out really high on Pro Football Focus, has the most snaps out of any player there on that line at 923. So you get him, there's a lot of consistency that takes place with that center and that quarterback. And to have him there alone is going to be able to provide a lot of consistency for BYU. On the right side, you've got players that have been there a long time. Some have worked in and out, done well. On the left side, you've got Paki Finau, who's transferred in from Washington. He's expected to start at left tackle. Had 426 snaps last year. Decent grades. Pass blocking was much better, but overall not fully high in his grading, but should be pretty solid there. So should be at least, more experienced than what Utah has on their offensive line, but we'll see how it gels. I still think with what they've got, this offense, should be pretty effective, assuming that receiver room comes together. And if not, this becomes the real worry, right? Where that puts a lot more pressure on Bear Bachmeier to do a lot more. Can he live up to that? Can they continue to do what they did last year with a ton of the draw plays that they were so effective with? Can they continue with that, or are teams going to scheme in on that? Do people look at the Texas Tech tape and find ways to find little wrinkles that they can get from that? Obviously, you have to have Texas Tech athletes to fully do that, but I think there's enough tape out there that BYU is going to have to be different in what they did last year. With that said, you also don't want to break what was working, right? So really curious to see here if they can get those receivers moving. I think this BYU squad could be really dangerous. Defensive side of the ball, honestly, pretty similar to last year. Obviously have some guys that moved on, but you have a really solid, central figures, or what am I trying? I'm really struggling today. I'm still brain fog from last week. I apologize. But a lot of solid players that have been there, who have been as starters or have been involved with this BYU defense to be able to make it work. I'm not going to list all of them. I don't have time for that. But some of the ones to focus on, obviously, is Isaiah Glasker, really solid linebacker that's going to continue to lead out there. He had a bit of a down year last year with injuries and some other issues, but still was effective in what he was able to do. I expect him to be able to be even better this year, just assuming that he's healthier and that everything is going better. I think he's poised for a really solid season, barring this defense being a mess. I don't think it should. There's a lot of veteran leadership there, a lot of holdover from last year that I don't know that there's a ton to screw up. But we don't know. So Isaiah Glasker, a guy that's going to be there. Lining up with him is Kate Olave from California. He transferred in. He was considered, if not, I don't remember, the number one linebacker, number two, something like that. One of the top linebackers in the transfer portal, and BYU snags him up. He had 662 snaps last year, graded higher than Isaiah Glasker on the defensive side of the ball in Pro Football Focus. Had 8 hurries, 3 sacks, 65 tackles, 1 pass breakup, 2 touchdowns. I mean, pretty solid player. I think there's still more for him that he can do. And I think he's a really solid player for them. In the backfield, you've got Evan Johnson as your corner. He's the leading guy back there. He's been able to be effective, had 824 snaps last year, was actually the top defensive player in Pro Football Focus grades on the defensive side with an 82.4. Really solid player, 7 pass breakups, 5 interceptions, 2 touchdowns, has the lowest NFL passer rating against him on the team. He's found ways to be able to impact the game wherever he is, and there's several times where he's found the ball and it's gone his way. So he's a guy that you're going to have to watch out for in the backfield. And then Falatau Satawala, obviously Utah fans are familiar with him. Really solid safety back there. He did get injured this summer. It was reported that he could miss a significant amount of time. With that said, I think he should be able to be back by fall camp, but there's probably some ramp up period there. So, is he going to be effective at the beginning of the season? We'll see. We're at game 9 here with Utah and BYU. So my understanding is, he should be fine, barring lingering issues. But I think Satawala is a guy that you're going to have to expect to have back there. Utah fans wanted him a ton. Obviously, his family has committed to Utah in a lot of different sports. His sister will be playing basketball for the women's side. This is a guy that got away, and he's been very effective for BYU. So really curious to see what happens with this defense. I think just to recap all this, my biggest questions for BYU, and I'll give 3. Can Bear Bachmeier take a step up in year 2? And I don't mean can he be good enough. I think he can. I think it's now that you've got teams that are going to scheme towards him a little bit more, and there's going to be a lot put on his shoulders. Can he be the guy to be able to do that? Right? We'll see. I think he can be, but it can't just be draw plays all the time. And maybe it can, but you've got to be able to move forward and have a little bit more in your repertoire. And part of that was him building last year, getting thrown into this, last minute. So, I'm really fascinated to see that. Next, who emerges at receiver? If BYU doesn't get an effective receiving corps this year, that's going to be a real issue for them. I don't know that their top end ceiling is as high if they can't get that, right? I think they can rely on LJ Martin a ton and they can do well with running the ball. But if they're not able to get some effective ball or some effective play from their receivers, it becomes a challenge. You become a lot more one-dimensional. You saw that with Utah last year, where they were much more one-dimensional early on, especially. But you saw how much of a challenge that can be. You can still see success. Utah, they finished the season really well, but they were just that much short of being able to get to the Big 12 title game. So, is there going to be much? I don't know. I think BYU's schedule is going to be favorable enough that it probably won't matter a ton, but it's still going to matter if they can't get it done. And then lastly, on the defensive side, we've talked about this. What does Kelly Papinga bring? Can he be effective? Can he run Jay Hill's offense the same way? Can he do what he needs to be effective? We'll find out. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions there, but really fascinated to see what takes place with these teams. Will obviously be a fun, entertaining game as it always is. But that's just the nature of these. They're fun games to have. and we'll see what happens. So moving on, we're going to do another episode on Thursday where we are going to focus on, let's see, what's my teams? I can't remember all of a sudden. Who's Utah's next opponent? I got it right here, and now it's gone. There we go, Arizona. We'll focus on Arizona, another team that should be near the top of the conference this year. What did they bring? Noah Fafita, that kind of stuff. Utah's known this for a while. So we'll see what happens. Got a lot to talk about, and then we'll get the last two before I get to Big 12 Media Days and really get into the thick of it on that. So thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time with me. Hopefully you're having a great day, and we will talk to you later.